Hi, this is Pastor Josh from First Baptist of Queen. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night study as we walk verse by verse through the Old Testament. Tonight, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 20, as David is on the run, beginning to be on the run from King Saul. So let's look at verse 24. So David hid himself in the field. And when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat food. The king sat on his seat, as at other times, on the seat by the wall. Jonathan sat opposite, and Abner sat by Saul's side. But David's place was empty. So the time came for the plan that David and Jonathan had come up with for their plan to be activated. David was in hiding in his spot somewhere out in the field, and everyone else was inside celebrating the new moon festival. And there had to be, great anticipation and expectation from both David in the field waiting for news and Jonathan inside steeling himself for the moment when Saul would ask about David. And as we all do when anticipating a conversation, Jonathan may have been repeating over and over in his mind what his response will be when he's asked finally by Saul. And you have Saul there. He's sitting in his seat by the wall, and Jonathan is sitting opposite him. It was suggested by a commentator that Saul's seat by the wall would have been a place of protection so that no one could come up from behind him. It may have even been, across from the entrance to the room, placing him the furthest from the entrance and giving him opportunity to see everybody who's entering the room. It also would have been a place of prominence, being the head of the room. And Jonathan, being opposite him, sitting opposite him, his seat could have been across the room or merely across the table. Wherever it was, he would need to have been close enough for Saul to ask about David's whereabouts. And this would have been easy if he were merely across the table. But the way in which Saul will eventually respond could also justify Saul shouting the question across the room for everyone to hear. And then you've got Abner sitting there. Abner's the commander of the army, and he's sitting right next to Saul. We're not told where exactly David's seat was to be located in relation to Saul or Jonathan, but wherever it was still very conspicuous that David was absent. Verse 26. Yet Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought, something has happened to him. He is not clean, surely he is not clean. But on the second day, the day after the new moon, David's place was empty, and Saul said to Jonathan, why has not the son of Jesse come to the meal either yesterday or today? Now, this is seemingly uncharacteristic of Saul here. He assumes the best of David, even in his absence, initially. Saul thought that David must be absent for a holy reason. How often do we think of the most negative possibility for why someone has done something, especially someone who may irritate us quite a bit? But Saul does not go to the negative yet. His first thought is that David must be doing what is right. And this is quite telling about Saul's nature and his default response and what his reign might have been if he had listened to the Lord. And as we all are, Saul's life is a seeming contradiction. One moment he believes the best of David, and the next he believes the worst of him. So then on day 2 of the 3-day festival, Saul's eyes again fall on David's empty seat. And at this point, his mind begins to wander into different potential possibilities for the reason for David's continued absence. A wandering mind can be a dangerous place when not guided by the Lord. Saul knows that if anyone will know what has happened to David, then it will be Jonathan. So he asked the question that David knew he would not be able to resist. The moment of decision for the anticipated question has finally arrived, and Jonathan, having been prepared, has his answer ready to go. Verse 28, Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. He said, let me go, for our clan holds a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there. So now if I have found favor in your eyes, let me get away and see my brothers. For this reason, he has not come to the king's table. Though this was the second day of the festival. It was not a holy day specifically. Only the day of the new moon was written in the law as needing to be observed. So even if David were still unclean, he could still attend the meal here on the second day because the day of recognition had passed. And yet David is still absent. So Saul asks Jonathan if he knows why David is not attending the festival. And Jonathan does a perfect job explaining what he and David worked out to say in this very situation. Jonathan is realizing that thus far in this plan, David has been exactly correct in anticipating how things would play out. Having been asked about where David was, Jonathan tells his father that David was commanded to return home. Now, this right here was not a part of the original plan that they had devised. This is a new part of the story. Jonathan's story about David's excuse is intensified by this addition of being commanded to return home. They had simply planned to tell Saul that this sacrifice was a usual occurrence and David was expected to return home. But now Jonathan adds this part about being commanded by his brother. Maybe Jonathan thought that being commanded sounded more serious and more necessary than simply going home because of a yearly family event. Maybe he hoped that this would make his father more sympathetic to David because he was following the direction of the head of his family, just as Saul expected Jonathan to follow the head of his family. But that in itself is very interesting because the command is said here to come from the brother. David's brother being able to issue commands to his siblings in this way could mean that either the father was so feeble that he had turned over patriarchal duties to his eldest son, or it means the father had died and the eldest son has inherited the responsibility. And so if Jonathan thought that Saul would be more willing to accept David's absence because he had been commanded by his brother, then he was very much mistaken. Verse 30, then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." So Saul instantly flew into a rage right in the middle of the festival meal in front of all of the guests. And in an attempt to lash out at Jonathan with insults, Saul resorts to insulting his mother. He sees rebellion and treason in Jonathan for what he believes to be disloyalty to himself. And he blames Jonathan's mother for those attitudes in Jonathan. Saul seems to be very aware, or at least highly suspect, of Jonathan's commitment to David as the next king. And Saul was right on that count, at least because Jonathan had already said in this chapter, verses 14 to 15, that he knew of the Lord's intention to make David king instead of himself. So Saul condemns Jonathan's suspected disloyal actions as shameful to himself and to the mother who birthed him. Notice that Saul says nothing of bringing shame on himself. Maybe he thought of himself as being above shame or incapable of being shamed. Notice also that Saul accuses Jonathan of bringing shame on his mother when Saul has just spoken shamefully about her in front of all of the festival guests. Then Saul wants Jonathan to turn over David so that he can become king after Saul. Saul had been told by Samuel that his children would not serve royally because of his own refusal to follow the Lord. He had also been told that the Lord had found someone else who would follow the Lord to be the next king. Now, in Saul's own court and his own household is a man who so clearly follows the Lord and has the Spirit within him. Saul has not been outright told that David is the next king, but even Saul, in his spirit-afflicted condition, can see that God has his hand on David. And Saul has fallen so far from the Lord that he wants to kill the very one that he knows the Lord wants to use. Verse 32. Then Jonathan answered Saul his father, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him, so Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. So Jonathan can see his father's rage, and yet he still tries to help his father. He still tries to convince Saul that this is not the way. Trying to reason with the unreasonable rarely turns out for the best. And also, trying to rationally convince a spiritual problem often does not work. But Jonathan obviously cares for his father and still hopes that he will turn back to the Lord. Jonathan says in the hearing of the room that David has done nothing deserving of execution. But Saul is done listening to anything else in defense of the person whom he considers to be his enemy. So Saul does what he seemingly always does. This has become his pattern. When Saul's anger is enraged, he grabs his spear so that just so happens to be always nearby. And he has already tried to spear David to death on 2 separate occasions. So now he sees Jonathan as David's ally, and he convinces himself that the only recourse is to put an end to Jonathan as well. Now, he doesn't hit Jonathan, but notice that the text informs us that it was not until the spear flew that Jonathan was finally convinced that David had been correct about Saul. And though the spear throw would have undoubtedly been devastating for Jonathan, it appears that it was necessary for Jonathan to realize how dire the situation really was. You know, sometimes we need desperate situations to fully understand God's plan and hand of intervention. Look at verse 34. And Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the 2nd day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. Saul was not so accurate with his spear throw to Jonathan. Notice that Jonathan is not said to have evaded the spear as David did. Jonathan is now incredibly angry. The word for fierce here means heat. His anger burned hot. He was overwhelmed that his father, the king, would act in so shamefully a manner, especially in public. His emotions over the whole incident were so intense that he fasted for the rest of the day. He had started the day planning to attend a feast, but now he was fasting. And his fasting came from his grief for David that grew out of his anger and had nothing to do with himself. Jonathan's emotions were not at all linked to his father's treatment of himself. He wasn't angry or grieved because his father had so publicly dishonored him. Jonathan's anger and grief were over the king's treatment of David. David had told Jonathan how the king was and what his intentions really were, but Jonathan didn't want to believe it. And now, having seen it firsthand, Jonathan could not deny what had happened to his father. Saul had publicly disgraced David when he wasn't even there to defend himself, and Jonathan knew now how far his father had fallen from the Lord. Verse 35. In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field to the appointment with David and with a little boy. And he said to his boy, "Run and find the arrows that I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And when the boy came to the place of the arrow that Jonathan had shot, Jonathan called after the boy and said, "Is not the arrow beyond you?" This now is the morning of the 3rd day of the festival, and Jonathan is hoping that nothing has happened to David and that he is in the place for the plan to work. Jonathan goes outside the city to the field for some target practice, as they had talked about. He gives his helper some instructions and a head start. Then Jonathan shoots an arrow way out beyond him. It's crazy for us to think that Jonathan would shoot an arrow downfield over the head of the boy who's out there to help him, but the boy doesn't hesitate. You know, maybe this was a regular occurrence. Maybe this was simply how target practice took place. So the arrow flies and the boy sees the arrow land and comes right to the spot without delay. But as soon as he gets to the arrow that Jonathan had shot, Jonathan calls out to tell him that the arrow is really further away. The boy must have been confused as to what Jonathan was talking about as he is standing there having just picked up the arrow. You know, haven't we all been in a situation where a boss or someone else tells us to do something when we are standing there having already done the thing that they want done? Well, the boy was undoubtedly not in a position to argue with the prince, especially considering the stories about how volatile his family was with weapons in their hands. But the command from Jonathan was not really for the boy. Anyway, it was a code phrase for David, who hopefully was hiding nearby beside the stone heap just out of sight. Verse 38. And Jonathan called after the boy, "Hurry, be quick, do not stay." So Jonathan's boy gathered up the arrows and came to his master, but the boy knew nothing. Only Jonathan and David knew the matter. And Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said to him, "Go and carry them to the city." So now Jonathan adds an extra level of urgency here to his instructions. He probably has a sense of dread and panic in his spirit over what he had seen his father do the day before. He wants the boy to leave quickly so that he can give David the full rundown of the situation. So the boy finishes gathering up the arrows that he had shot and whatever other arrows had been brought to the field. Then Jonathan does something very interesting and very uncharacteristic for his family, considering how his father has operated. Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy. Notice the scripture doesn't say that he simply gave his bow to the boy. He gave his weapons to the boy. Jonathan had apparently come out to the field carrying more than just a bow, and he sent the boy with every weapon he carried. He completely disarmed himself. Whereas whenever his father met David lately, he made sure to always be carrying his spear in his hand. Jonathan was a man wholly different from his father, both in practice and in heart. And this serves to further contrast Jonathan and his father. One of them was incredibly hostile to the ways of God, and the other of them did not want to fight against what God intended to do. Jonathan actively served in the way of God, while Saul actively worked against the way of God. Verse 41. And as soon as the boy had gone, David rose from beside the stone heap and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. And they kissed one another and wept with one another, David weeping the most. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever." And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So David bows to Jonathan to show humility and submission, and that his life was entirely in his hands. He bowed 3 times, which is the most that anyone in the Bible bows in one interaction. Then they exchange a kiss and weep. Now, much has been made of this kiss by those who misunderstand ancient Middle Eastern cultures. Many cultures around the world still practice such a kiss as acceptance or as goodbyes. This was one of goodbye and not of romantic affection. It is always dangerous to interpret ancient biblical customs using modern 21st century American mindsets. And after their expression of grief over the situation and the realization that life would never be the same for them, and that this would be goodbye, possibly forever, Jonathan feels the need to again remind David of his promise to take care of his family in the future. Now, Jonathan had already repeatedly reminded David of this promise earlier in the chapter, and he is not going to let this last moment pass without receiving one last assurance of David's promise to protect his family. And he again invokes the name of the Lord in his reminder, making sure that David would remember his promise. Then Jonathan goes back into the city, and David leaves to go on the run for a number of years until Saul dies at the hand of the Philistines. Now, I find it quite courageous and bold of Jonathan to go right back into the city where his father had tried to murder him the day before. But for Jonathan, even though he knew David was the Lord's plan, he was going to remain with his father, maybe to try and help him some more. Maybe he hoped to be able to eventually turn his father back to the Lord. Look at verse 1 of chapter 21. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" Now, it seems as though after the Philistines destroyed Shiloh, that the tabernacle had been resettled at Nob, which became a city for the priests. And we're not exactly sure where Nob may have been, but some believe it could have been as close as just about a mile away. And Ahimelech the priest was Ahijah's brother, and Ahijah had become a spiritual advisor to Saul after Samuel had left him. So David may have had some level of uncertainty about how much this priest could be trusted. But even with that suspicion in the air, David had to go somewhere and had to trust someone to some degree. So his natural inclination is to run to the tabernacle to a man of God seeking some kind of help. But when he arrives, Ahimelech sees him and is instantly afraid because something is not what it appears. Something appears to be very wrong. Every other time David has left the city, there's been a whole host of men with him. When he goes to fight, usually his entire battalion with him. And if you remember, his group of fighters is made up of 1,000 men. And so now here comes David running as though he were fleeing from the city. And if David really were fleeing from the city, then he must be fleeing from the king. And what then would happen to Ahimelech if he helped a fleeing David? And all this is going over through Ahimelech's mind when David approaches. Verse 2. And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has charged me with the matter and said to me, let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now, then what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here." So in David's uncertainty about Ahimelech's loyalty, it would seem as though he decides to come up with a lie to cover his tracks with the priest. Now, he tells the priest that he's on a secret assignment for the king, having been charged to tell no one about the specifics of the mission. And it has been suggested that maybe David could have been using the word king here to refer to his heavenly king, as he does throughout the Psalms. And if that were the case, then he would not be lying outright, though he would be deliberately hiding the truth, deceiving. And so he also tells Ahimelech that he has sent his men, on ahead to a secret meeting place. He has apparently left Gibeon without any supplies, which would have been another red flag for the priest. Here is the greatest warrior in the country, one of the greatest planners and strategists in the country, and he arrives without any food or supplies or weapons. Maybe Ahimelech has also heard what had happened at Naioth when David went to Samuel, and Saul had sent groups of messengers in pursuit of David to arrest him for execution. Now, whatever Ahimelech suspects, we're not told, his response to David is really quite unexpected. Verse 4. And the priest answered David, "I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women." And David answered the priest, "Truly, women have been kept from us, as always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?" So Ahimelech didn't have any regular bread to be eaten by just anyone. All that he had was what's called the bread of the presence that has been set out before the Lord on the previous day, and it's been removed. This bread was only supposed to be eaten by the priests, men who had been assigned by the Lord for the task. But this was also not a regular or common circumstance, as Ahimelech must have realized. Notice that in Ahimelech's reply is the immediate concession of possibly allowing David to have the bread. Ahimelech's the one who suggests the bread. It's as though Ahimelech were telling David that normally he could not have had this kind of bread, but he would let him have it if he and his men had set themselves aside for the Lord's purpose for a time. And David confirms that that is the case, as it is always the case, even when he goes out on just an ordinary errand, and much more now that he is on a specific assignment for the king. Ahimelech would be considered by some of the priests and future rabbis here to be violating the law by even suggesting that David take this specific bread. But as Jesus explained in Matthew 12, the preservation of life is far more important than adherence to the ceremonial law. And as the priest, Ahimelech had the authority to interpret the necessary application of such ceremony in extenuating circumstances, like this one. Verse 6. So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. So the priest takes the bread and gives it to David. And this is no insignificant act. Ahimelech is doing something that will end up costing him his life. He's helping David while he is on the run for his life from the king who has seemingly gone mad. And he helps David in such an overt way that would be considered to be a violation by many of the law sticklers. This should be quite convicting for us today, considering how many things we adhere to sometimes to the detriment of others. I mean, how important is it really to wear your Sunday best when coming to church? How important is it really to not take any food or drinks into the sanctuary? How important is it really to not wear a hat in the sanctuary? How important is it really to sit in your precious and coveted sanctuary seat each week? What matters more? adhering to those unwritten rules, or welcoming and helping someone who needs to hear the gospel. Life and the gospel always matter more. Look at verse 7. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. So David and Ahimelech, they're not alone when they're discussing the bread of the presence. And you would think they might have been a little more discreet when it came to talking about violating elements of the law to help David, but they did not discuss in private or try to hide their actions. And they were seen by Doeg the Edomite, who happened to be the head of all of Saul's herdsmen. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 47 references Saul himself fighting and defeating the Edomites, who were enemies of Israel. So Doeg may have been a prisoner of war who demonstrated some level of skill so as to be entrusted to be the chief of the herdsmen. Or maybe he was simply loyal to whomever paid the best. For whatever reason, a former enemy of the nation of Israel is there in the tabernacle overhearing the conversation between Ahimelech and David. Then we are given a very interesting phrase concerning Doeg, because it says that he was detained before the Lord, and there's no further explanation given about what exactly that could mean. You know, to be detained before the Lord could mean that he was there against his will. Maybe he was enduring a form of discipline or punishment, or a part of his sentence as a prisoner of war. For whatever reason, this Edomite is there in the room and he's not allowed to leave. And his presence would end up being a source of evil in the not too distant future. Verse 8. Then David said to Ahimelech, "Then have you not here a spear or a sword on hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." And the priest said, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here." And David said, "There is none like that. Give it to me." David reveals to Ahimelech that he is in need of more than food, but also of weapons. So he asked the priests of all, people and in the tabernacle of all places, if there might be a weapon of some kind lying around. It's quite possible that David had left the sword of Goliath there at Nob after the battle in the valley of Elah. If David had left the sword there previously, it would make perfect sense as to why he was asking specifically for a spear or sword. And Ahimelech reveals that he has kept the sword wrapped in a secret place behind the ephod so that no one could have found it. It has been kept for such a time as this, when David would again be in need of it. He had been the last one to use it when he had cut off Goliath's head, and now he would use it again as his personal weapon as he was going out on the run for a very, very long time. And now the priest at Nob, he's both fed and armed, a fugitive on the run from the king, who also happens to be the greatest warrior in the nation and the next anointed king. So this is not going to turn out very well for Ahimelech. But doing the right thing for the king is often very costly. Thank you for joining us as we work our way through the Old Testament verse by verse, studying the entire thing. I hope you'll come back next week as we see what happens next when David leaves the tabernacle there at Nob with the sword of Goliath in hand.